So, welcome to the Design and Posthumanism Network's first online event, public event actually. So you are more than welcome to join this session full of inspiration, full of ideas, connections. So let's get started. We have prepared, should we get the slides, Anton, if we get the agenda, how our session looks like. So we will start. I know that many of you might be somehow familiar with posthumanism already, but there are a lot of people also who think that this is something really interesting, and you're curious to hear, what is this all about? So Thomas Laurien, he will be first starting with the introduction to the Design and Posthumanism Network, and then Anton, Poikolainen Rosén, he will be sharing what is posthuman design, what is it really? And then we have three presentations with amazing global speakers from all over the world, with sharing their cases, projects, and the theme today is water. And that's something Thomas will also tell you more about. So we will have the keynotes and then we will stop the recording there. So then we will move to the workshops. And I know that some people, it's quite late in some countries. So you are very, very welcome to stay on the workshop phase of this session. But if you need to go, it's okay, you can go. And but we would love you to join the workshop and to really share your views and discuss and mingle with fellow session people. My name is Satu Samira Hamed. I'm part of the posthumanism Design and Posthumanism Network board with some people that Thomas will be telling you closely about, and I'll be hosting this event, so making sure that everything goes smoothly. Again, so much welcome from the bottom of my and everybody's organizer's heart. It's fantastic to see you here. But let's get started. Thomas, can you tell us a little bit about what is the Design and Posthumanism Network all about?
Yeah, thank you, Satu, for the introduction. So, hello and welcome. As you heard, and as you can see, my name is Thomas Laurien, and I will start this promising and exciting evening with a brief description of the history and the purpose of the network that is hosting this event. I am a designer, artist, curator, researcher, and educator based at HDK Valand, Academy of Art and Design at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. The Design and Posthumanism Network aims to be a meeting place for everyone who is interested in the intersection between design and posthumanism. And by design, we of course mean design practice as well as design education and design research. And we also understand the concept of design in an open and inclusive way. So a few words about the history of the network. 6 years ago, almost exactly, in October 2018, a design festival was organized in Gothenburg here at HDK Valand. As part of the program, I proposed a public conversation about design and posthumanism. I contacted a few designers who I knew worked in this field, and together we created a half-day program. Afterwards, we sat down to summarize the presentation, and it was in the subsequent conversation that the idea of a network was born. In addition to myself, Åsa Ståhl, Kristina Lindström, Erik Sandelin, and Martin Avila participated in this conversation, plus a few others who have since left the network. What we shared was an experience of feeling alone with our interests in posthumanism, and that a network could be a way to counteract this feeling. Initially, we thought of a network in Sweden, but when Danish friends soon got in touch and asked if they could become members, we thought, screw borders. The network currently has around 90 members, most of whom live in Europe, but we also have members in Asia, Australia, and South America. Soon, in the beginning, we created a placeholder website with our blurbs, and we created a newsletter where we shared information on various topics related to posthumanism. In 2021, member Johanna Mehl stepped forward and offered to lead the process of creating a more comprehensive and visually richer website, which we launched in 2022, and that's the one we still use. The network tries to be non-hierarchical and has no traditional board, but we have recently created a board that meets once a month to develop the network. And currently, in addition to myself, the board consists of Janna Lumiruso, Johanna Mehl, Anton Poikolainen Rosén, Sebastian Gatz, Sven Kvattflig, Svenja Köhne, and Satu Samira Hamed. What also needs to be mentioned is that the network is non-financed and self-organizing. We do what we can and are able to do, but we do it unpaid. 3 members of the board have initiated and developed this evening's theme and program, and I will soon hand over to them. A few final words on the theme of water, which I myself work a lot with in both my research and artistic practice. I have just returned from a very transformative meeting in Venice, Italy, with another network, the Confluence of European Water Bodies, which brings together artists, lawyers, environmental activists, and scholars from various fields to explore how the idea of rights of nature can be realized in a European context. On my way home, I stopped in Hamburg to visit the water pressure exhibition. And I will now read a few lines written by the curators of the exhibition that describe the current situation well. Quote, "Water, whether too much or too little, clean or unsafe, is one of the most pressing human preoccupations. Today, we face a global water crisis due mainly to mismanagement and overuse. From melting glaciers to rising sea levels, from drought to flooding, global warming is expressed most acutely through water. Already, 40% of people are affected by water scarcity, and with human-induced climate change, this is getting much worse. If we are to share a livable future for all, we must urgently rethink how we value and manage this contested resource." End of quote. Tonight, we will hear 3 presentations of work where design and posthumanism have met. And these stories will surely add layers to the state of play I have just read out. With these words, I would now like to hand over to Anton, Satu, and Sebastian, who have put together this impressive program for this evening. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you. I also need to unmute myself, and now I did that. So now I have the impossible task to summarize design and posthumanism in around 15 minutes. And for some of you, this will be kind of very basic. And for some of you, it will be maybe very new. But I think it's good that we have a kind of common ground that we start from when we then kind of delve into the presentations that are more going into very specific concepts and so on.
Yeah. Anton, could we, like, where is Sebastian? I want to, like, can you raise your hand? So everybody knows who Sebastian also is, who's been part of creating this event.
That's great. Can you unmute yourself, Sebastian?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I don't know. I don't have much to say at the moment. I'm Sebastian Getz. I'm a PhD student at Konstfack University and also part of the network. And I help organizing this evening today with the other two. So yeah, looking forward to the evening.
Thank you, Sebastian. And Anton, go for it.
Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is situated knowledge, which is an idea in posthumanism and other related research that knowledge is not only this kind of thing coming from above, but in each and every context, we have specific kinds of knowledge, and the person we are, our previous background, our privileges, and so on shapes what we know. And the reason I want to start with this is that the kind of presentation that follows is my situated knowledge. So this is my perspective on posthumanism. Other persons may have other perspectives of posthumanisms. But it's also not in a way only my perspective, because I have been the co-editor of this book, Modern Human Design in Practice, that will be released in the end of this year in December. And there we worked a lot in the introduction to kind of write the Modern Human Manifesto and also a lexicon for modern human design. I will not go through the whole lexicon, but it's kind of grounded in these discussions that we had when writing this book. So the kind of main point maybe with posthumanism is to focus on relationality and entanglement. And what this means is, in practice, is this move from this kind of hierarchical worldview where we put the human or maybe even the man on the top of the pyramid, and all other life is kind of lesser, to instead focus on this more flat network where we should consider all living organisms and perhaps even technologies to an equal extent. We kind of recognize that we are all mutually affecting each other. But with that said, just because we kind of recognize that everything deserves equal recognition, we can't, of course, kind of consider everybody's needs equally. So here we need a care ethics, which actually sees kind of working actively with these relationships as the very central and kind of tricky part of posthumanism. Who do we care for? How can we extend care in the network? Perhaps I have more responsibility for those who are closer to me than those who are further away. I mean, here there are not easy questions, but the idea of care ethics is a way of practically kind of navigating and working in this network, in this kind of worldview of mutual interdependence. Another kind of central concepts when we have this focus on interdependence is agency. So a common expression is to say that things have agency, meaning that they can affect something. But in a posthuman view, agency isn't really something that is kind of within the object, but agency is the thing that happens between different entities. So for example, I affect the plant as much as the plant affects me. I mean, even the air around me, I can move the air, but the air also causes some friction to me. So agency is always two-directional or even multi-directional, because we're of course affected by a lot of entities all the time. But kind of critical posthumanism looks at where the kind of power imbalances are. So are some entities, some species kind of having less agency in the overall system than they would actually kind of deserve, or are some entities kind of utilizing their agency to push others down. But I wanted to talk about this just because it's quite common to colloquially like say that you have agency, but really it's this more kind of complex relational perspective on agency. Another thing that posthumanism's modern human design does is this kind of resisting of binaries. So blurring the nature culture binary, recognizing that kind of human culture comes from nature. We are of nature. We are not really separate from nature. That's why the word more than human is sometimes used to kind of remind us that humans are a part of nature. So the same thing, self-environment separation, maybe the way our self is constructed is in constant relationships to the environment. Also, the mind-body separation is challenged. So we are actually thinking through our body. We're having embodied knowledge. We are always a mind in a body, so we can't really separate those things. And of course, the human, non-human, but also more kind of perhaps tightly connected to design. We challenge the human technology boundary. So technologies become more merged in our everyday lives. It's actually quite hard to separate our experience of the world because our experience of the world is very often kind of mediated through these technologies that maybe augments our senses. I mean, a very simple example is even glasses that makes you perceive the world in a different way. We can also critique the kind of digital physical boundary of what is in real life, so to say. And another way of framing what posthuman design is could maybe be to show some examples of posthuman design. And these are just 3 examples that I found kind of illustrative of what it could be. It could, of course, be a lot of different things. So in some parts of India, there is a practice of building living root bridges, which is a kind of construction where the roots of the trees are still living. So it's a living tree, but humans can use these to kind of cross waters. And of course, not all design can be built with kind of living things, but I think this is very powerful as a metaphor. So how can you think of your design as, instead of kind of cutting down the tree, extracting the resource, having wood and building with it, can I build something where the other organism is still living, is still thriving, while it kind of benefits humans? So there is kind of mutual beneficiary here without being extractive. Perhaps an example that is more kind of close to some people's everyday life is this practice of not mowing lawns. So pollinators need food, and the way we have kind of designed our environments, it means that there is like too little flowering plants, so we need to have more flowering plants. And one way of getting more flowering plants is to not cut lawns, to not have these kind of clean green deserts from a biodiversity perspective. So here the role of design is to actually not intervene. The conscious decision to refrain from intervention. However, we might want to communicate this intervention to people. So instead we design, for example. So we can still be designers, we can still do things, but we can kind of frame our inaction as something purposeful, and then try to communicate the kind of underlying meaning of that inaction to people. And a third example is this repurposed meat thermometer that some urban farmers that I work with use to measure compost temperature. And this is, of course, like a kind of very mundane technology that was already existed. I'm very sure that the designers of this technology were not thinking, oh, we're going to design a posthuman technology. But to me, this is a very good posthuman example. First of all, it shows kind of reuse of technology. So we don't necessarily have to make new things. We can kind of reconfigure the relationships, and it gets new meaning. So what was once used to measure temperature in meat is now used to measure temperature in compost. But the way this temperature thermometer was used is that you kind of stick your whole hand into the compost with this thermometer. You see this woman here, her hand is kind of covered in compost. So that creates a very embodied, close relationship to the rest of the more than human world. So here the role of kind of design of technologies may be to strengthen these relationships and create these experiences of immersion in the world, more than human world. So with that, I actually want to leave the floor for our first speakers.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Irina, could you just put up a presentation?
Yes, let me just pull it up now.
All right. Well, Irina does that. Yeah, I'll just introduce myself. Hi, my name's Prateek Shankar. I'm a strategic designer, design researcher, and a teacher. I currently work at Dark Matter Labs, which I assume some of you are familiar with. We are strategic design firm that is intent on creating system demonstrators of posthuman, post-capitalist frames of engaging with society at the urban level and at the planetary level. I work at in a part of the organization, a new space that we're calling Planetary Civics, which is essentially about constructing institutional and civic capacities that function at the planetary scale or respond to the needs of specific planetary threats, or that respond to questions of a certain planetary commons, such as the ocean, or you could think of the Himalayan glaciers as a sort of commons, or the moon, which is a very obvious example of a commons, but also more intangible things like wind currents, or air currents, or whale corridors, each of which sort of have very specific and very powerful sort of influences on the entire biosphere. Yeah, so we do a bunch of work on that, and Irina and I have been sort of working on our own project, more specifically on more than human governance. We met some years ago working on a design manual for a post-Anthropocene, I guess, world, a design practice for the post-Anthropocene, which we came to call the Policene. And we put together something called the Policene Design Manual, which is still in progress. That's where we met. And I'll hand over to Irina now.
Yay, thanks, Prateek. Maybe you can drop a link in the chat for the Policene Design Manual, just because it might be relevant for people in this particular Zoom room. Yeah, so my name is Irina. I'm an independent designer and writer and researcher and all those extra multi-hyphenates. I generally refer to my work as systems transition design, and it often happens at the intersection of existential risk and structural injustice. So I started as a typographer and started working on language revitalization, and from there sort of wanted to keep zooming out and look at the systemic issues that that design maybe traditionally didn't concern itself with, but increasingly needs to. I was really happy to stumble upon this particular network. Actually immediately found a logistical connection with Anton on the organizing committee, who's at Aalto University. And I was affiliated recently with the design department during my recent Fulbright term when I was in Finland researching the impact of Arctic change on reindeer herders. And I am currently in North Vancouver, Canada. So I guess I will just get us started. And I'll start by setting the scene, although Anton did such a good job of doing that already. And this particular audience, I'm sure, already has quite an expansive, colorful understanding of what post-human futures might look like. This is a shipping map from the year 2074, when marine traffic through the Bering Strait has dramatically increased due to Arctic sea ice melt. And the idea here is that the ebb and flow of autonomous commercial shipping vessels are responding in real time to the migration and movement of all the region's beluga whale populations, which are monitored by this, advanced network of underwater hydrophones. And as those pods navigate, they set into effect these automatic reroutes where hundreds of heavy, massive cargo vessels correct course and move towards alternative lanes or designated holding zones to give space. And this was a speculative artifact that I presented this past summer at the World Biodiversity Forum in Davos. It hints at plausible adaptations of technology and commerce as more than human agency isn't just taken into consideration, but also reinforced, right, through logistical and regulatory infrastructures. So Scott Klinker, he describes the practice of critical design as, quote, trying on a new set of values embodied in a polemic design proposal. It becomes a way of visualizing how our values may evolve. And I would argue that design should actually go beyond just expanding our imagination for the sake of inspiration or aspiration, and it should also raise difficult questions that recomplicate the decisions that we're making today and towards desirable futures. So, for example, with this map, when you sit with it, it also raises ethical questions, right? That might arise about data, for example, like when we track animals this accurately in real time, how is that data protected from hackers or poachers? And what does cross-species data sovereignty look like? What layers of opacity would be necessary under different conditions? And for me, the questions of agency that were already brought up and affordance loom really large. So when we invoke the term interspecies today, it's often very unilateral in practice. So how long will it be before the human role can go beyond the sort of paternalism, right? Before non-humans can grant or retract or even request meaningful consent. And does that consent end at the thresholds, right, that seem to ontologically separate life from non-life? So we're thinking about when it comes to rocks and rivers and machines, mountains, and of course, like in general, this session today is asking about water. So yeah, I will pass it back to Prateek for the next section.
Thank you.
Prateek, you can just let me know.
Yeah, can you just stay on this slide while thanks for setting that up, Irina. So this was a project that Irina had done earlier this year and that she presented at a conference in Davos to pretty good response, but we use this sort of as a starting point for a larger project. In all the work we've done, I think we've come to this, and I'm sure you've sort of encountered this as well. There is a sort of renewed interest in posthuman theory, and for that matter, even broadly critical theory across the board in the last few years. And you're seeing a resurgence of a lot of ideas from the 70s and the 80s around things like situated knowledges, cyborgism, lots of ideas from post-colonial theory like planetarity. And one could say that this is symptomatic just of just how bad things are getting. There's a cyclicality to our own panic. But the issue that me and Irina have sort of arrived at is that in all the work that we were doing or encountering as designers, we kept hitting this frustration that it seems like all these more than human discussions somehow get limited to artifacts that can create some sort of empathy for the non-human, which is the baseline of any of this work. But our frustration was that things never seem to go that much further, right? Cool, I feel bad for the whales. Now what? But then if you start beginning that process, it becomes really impossible because the more than human itself or the post-human itself, I mean, there are so many versions of conceptualizing the post-human. There are specific sort of, if you take the transhuman extreme of people that want to sort of merge themselves with technology, which seems to be a very dominant narrative in this world, or you can talk about the more than human as encompassing everything from flora and fauna to machinery and some sort of synthetic model of intelligence. Or you could just think of the more than human as anything that is not human, which gets very interesting, because even within humanity, we seem to afford humanity only to some of us and not to all of us. So that's a whole question to ask. I mean, what the hell does it mean to be human at all? But within all of these things, we realize it's massively confusing, and we needed some sort of overarching frame that might allow us to understand what's happening when we talk about more than human governance, and understand how different entities interact with each other, so as to create these opportunities for more than human governance. So, for example, in the map that Irina shared, we're seeing specifically ships and whales as these two sort of entities. And she has sort of created this map as a way for us to visualize their interactions, for what really happens at that event space when they meet, and how the nuances of that event space might dictate exactly how they engage with each other, and how that might translate into things like regulation and policy. So we kind of got very, very interested in that idea of the event space between entities. Irina, can you just head to the next slide? So very quickly, I think to counter this essentialism, of course, a lot of systems theory is really big in the design world now, highly inspired by some of the Latourian ideas of actor network theory. And that's also kind of how we began the work. We started thinking about a system and thinking about different entities within a system. But systems theory, or at least the way we've experienced it in the design world, when it comes down to something like systems mapping, also seems to reduce the system into this large linear conglomeration of causal linkages. So something happens that leads to something else, that leads to something else. And it doesn't really account for what happens when the something happens, because the conditions change. So obviously, like any self-respecting person reading Latour, we started reading about assemblages and assemblage theory. You started reading Guattari and Deleuze. So a quick primer on assemblage theory. And can you just go to the next slide again, Irina? So what the assemblage is trying to represent a constellation of entities in interaction. What is important to understand about an assemblage as opposed to a system is that the formation of an assemblage is inherently dependent on the interrelationships and the co-constitution of the entities within an assemblage. And I know I'm saying a bunch of things right now, and I will simplify this. We'll start very quickly with the Deleuzian Guattarian sort of one of their definitions, which I quite like. Irina, could we just go next? He defines it as a multiplicity, which is made up of many heterogeneous terms and which establishes liaisons, relationships between them across ages, sexes, and reigns, different natures. Thus, the assembly's only unity is that of a co-functioning. It is a symbiosis, a sympathy. It is never filiations which are important, but alliances, alloys. They're not successions, lines of descent, but contagions, epidemics, or the wind. You can actually forget about this entire definition, because the only thing we really want you to hold on to is the idea of not just relationships and relationality, but the fact that that relationality is co-constitutive, that it ends up defining both the entities. The entities themselves are defined in their interaction. Next slide. So here's a quick example that Guattari uses. This is an assemblage of a Mongolian archer, right? And if you had to break down the assemblage of a Mongolian archer, it has the archer himself, who's just a rider. There is him sitting on a horse. There is the saddle. There are the stirrups. There is his bow. All of that comes together as an assemblage to create what is a Mongolian rider. Next slide. But you could obviously reduce this whole thing to a smaller assemblage, because the entities within this assemblage that is a Mongolian horse rider also contains smaller entities that are also assemblages. For example, the bow itself is an assemblage, which is like a combination of leather, bamboo, and a series of other materials you need to make a bow. So somehow the assemblage of a bow the assemblage of a horse that you can ride. All of that comes together to create this larger assemblage. And the same thing can be zoomed out further. Could you go to the next slide, Irina? I mean, you could zoom out further and talk about the Eurasian steppes, this entire area as being a larger assemblage, which is co-constitutive of these riders, of the polities that these riders make possible, of the grasslands that they encompass. Now, what this gives us as opposed to a system is something more than a causal link. There's a relational link. And it also gives us the ability to nest relationships within each other and kind of give us this almost infinite tessellation. So these are some of the sort of specific ideas from this Deleuzian map that seem very interesting to us. But our interest, again, was not necessarily in visualizing the whole world's complexity again. We are very, very interested in the more than human encounter. So Irina, next slide. So our focus was on really trying to frame, next slide, that relationship, specifically that relationship. What happens when the horse and the rider interact, right? What are the things that are happening in that moment? So we sort of, pulling from assemblage theory, we kind of pulled out two different ideas that seemed essential to us, which is the idea of individuation and territorialization. Can we go to the next slide? And what that means is that in the different ways I've described the assemblage today, you can individuate them into specific entities. So you can individuate a person, you can individuate him as a rider, you can individuate him sitting on a horse with his bow as a very specific military apparatus. You can individuate 15 of those horse riders as a small army, right? And that kind of gives you these two ideas. Territorialization is sort of the spatial extension of that. So a nation territorializes itself. A human being territorializes itself by sort of your epidermis. I'll move a little faster now. And that sort of gives you sort of spatial ingredients for what we're trying to do. At the same time, we were reading of some excellent work by Deborah Bird on sort of temporal diversity and the different ways that time is experienced by different species. Can we go to the next slide, Irina? So very quickly, she mentioned something called sequence, which is as simple as, I gain certain knowledge from my parent, who gains it from my grandparent, and so on. And you can think of, for example, a plant. And this is sort of the existence of a sequential time. And at the same time, this can happen parallelly across different entities and who are also interacting. So there's sort of a synchronous experience of these different sequences. So these four ideas, individuation, territorialization, synchrony, and sequence, brought us to what we were calling an intraface. So instead of thinking of that moment of encounter as a site between a human and the more than human, we decided to think of it as an event space because something is happening. There is an establishment of boundaries, of meaning, and sort of a sedimentation of certain power differentials. And more often than not now, the power differential is way towards the human. How can we design an interface? What does interfacial design look like when it tries to account for everybody's agency in that system, but in a way that doesn't make it seem like competition and violence is not part of the natural world? It is a part of the natural world. There is the imbalance in a power differential is the issue right now, not so much the existence of violence as much as the existence of the possibility of mass violence. So yeah, we have a quick sort of working definition, which is where I will leave Irina so that she can take us into some of the nuances of these questions.
Cool, thanks. Thank you. And I will go into some of the applied framework. And so safe to say, like, all of these things are very intrinsically entangled in concept and in practice, as you just heard. And we're thinking of these more than human approaches across disciplines as stratified under these configurations, perhaps. And of course, any sort of categorization will involve some amount of essentializing, but I think the framework can still be a useful tool when overlapping theory and practice. So also a quick note here to say that there is a vast array of more than human to more than human interfaces, not to mention perhaps more than human to self interfaces, but we'll focus on what falls under the purview of present day governance and responsibility, or as Haraway would say, responsibility, to remove some of the ego from that. Okay, so first is ontology. Ontological approaches to more than human practice take place between within this framework, human and the self. So human to self interfacing is foundational in that it captures these sort of deep code transformations, if you will, within one's own personal relationality with the more than human world. So it's a philosophical pretext, but it's not necessarily a prerequisite to operationalization, which is what Prateek was saying about what we wanted to draw out as an example with the shipping map. A quick example here is the Tairara National Park in New Zealand. So when this park was recognized as a legal person in 2014, the legal shift also carried through to the language and the customs that are used to relate to that entity on an individual level. So instead of the sort of typical concession fee or permitting system, visitors enter into what's called a friendship agreement in order to access the park. Governance approaches, on the other hand, are fundamentally human-to-human interfacing, despite the referent, in this case, being the more than human. So they encompass things like regulatory laws, protocols, social norms, et cetera, that are designed to codify the human recognition in response to more than human agency, but they are between human and human. And so I just mentioned the rights of nature in the previous example, wherein legal personhood is granted to environmental entities. So in the case of governance, humans will often act as proxies on behalf of the more than human constituents. And this also comes with its own legal and ethical complications, right? So here's a water-related example. In India, the High Court declared the Ganges and Yamuna rivers to have, quote, the status of a legal person with all corresponding rights, duties, and liabilities of a living person. So that decision framed the rivers as minors under the law and appointed state officials as their guardians, which sparked controversy because granting rights and protections to more than human entities also calls into question what humans might account those or hold those entities accountable for. And ontological shifts are well and good, but a watershed isn't going to respond to disincentives like high taxation or very human punishments like social shaming, right? So instead, a human guardian in this case could be held liable. They could be sued or imprisoned as a consequence of something like severe flooding. In Bangladesh, for example, reinforcing these sorts of river protection measures could actually then result in the eviction of people who live along the riverfront, which would in effect be punishing the poor rather than disincentivizing corporations that cause those knock-on environmental damages in the first place. But even as some of these examples exhibit the usual failings of human governance, we do find a lot of creativity and care in the approach. So just this past summer, when we were coming up with these frameworks, the Brazilian municipality here granted the legal right for waves to, quote, continue breaking perfectly at the mouth of the Rio Doce, which is lovely. And by framing the agency of these waves as essential to the well-being of human communities and surfers and the coastal economy, that bill extends a sort of relational layer, right, of protection to the wider assemblage surrounding those waves. So that includes, quote, consistent water quality levels, dam discharge, dune system protection, sand replenishment, ocean floor monitoring, shoreline armoring, coastal development control, et cetera. So like strategic systems design, really well considered human-to-human interfaces can very successfully lean into the inherent complexity of an assemblage. And just with how human to self interfacing would have no teeth, as it were, without human-to-human interfacing, the opposite is also true, right? Because laws can disincentivize bad actors, but they won't teach anyone how to be a good neighbor and collaborator, human or otherwise. So the final approach we'll talk about can be described as responsible contact, which are human to more than human interfaces in a true spatial sense, like Prateek was saying. And I also want to quickly bring up a personal pet peeve of mine, which is that these days the term stewardship is offered up as this alternative to irresponsible or self-serving way that humans have occupied the planet. But stewardship without intent to maximize multilateral agency, I would argue, between human and more than human, can't move beyond that paternalism. So it's like defending the Amazon rainforest with the ontological tools of a Viennese palace gardener. Prateek got a kick out of that one when I first said it, so I would try it out here. Human stewardship, so then it, tends to assume or perpetuate this helplessness while taking on a hero complex. And I would suggest, we flip the script. So whenever humans are confronted with something powerful like a tsunami or something inevitable like a tide, we might be tempted to attribute an interface that maximizes the water's agency as, human receptivity or deference to more than human agency. But I would challenge us to start thinking of that more as more than human agents stewarding us, right? So it's the difference between recognizing their willful agency rather than just allowing for that agency by negating human agency. And this is the final example, a really fun case study by Thomas Buitendijk, excuse my terrible pronunciation. And he has a great paper where he gives an example of what he calls agential indeterminacy. And he's comparing different sand motors, which are often described as nature-based solutions. They are implemented by depositing a bunch of sand on a shoreline and then letting the sediment sort of be dispersed over time and replenish beaches. He gives some examples of human implemented ones like this one on the left of the slide, and then he deems the most successful case to actually be this accidental one in Dublin Bay, which you can see on the right. Here's an excerpt where he puts it really nicely. He says, a lack of predetermined outcomes has created space for other than human capability to unfold, and the result is more productive collaboration with far greater longevity and limited need for active human management. So he sort of leaves us with a call to good neighborship during co-creation, which also echoes Alex Steffen's call to become a good ancestor for all future entities that will inherit this planet. So I think that leaves us with this huge question of where are the intrafacial boundaries actually drawn in each instance of each interaction, and by whom and for whom are they set? And when stakes are really high, like they often are these days, how can we sort of negotiate those boundaries in our encounters with the more than human? And so, as the case between good neighbors, these questions don't necessarily elicit straightforward answers, but we would argue that they should instead launch an ongoing dialogue that requires a lot of grace and active negotiation, creative negotiation, and sometimes conciliation of diverging wants and needs between different entities. So yeah, that's it for us. Sorry, I think we just ran to the top of our time, but I'm excited to hear the following presentations and how specific cases of water-related interfacing might complement or completely problematize everything we just said. Since this is our pretty early stab at defining some mechanisms and helpful frameworks for more than human approaches, we're super open to feedback and provocations and expansions on it. So yeah, feel free to reach out to us even after this. I think Prateek, do you want to add anything before we hand it over?
No, I think we just flung a lot of words and lots of stuff. I'd love to answer some questions.
You can add some questions on the chat if there are any. If not, then I think we can continue. Lots of hearts for response ability. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it's time for our next speakers. We can also use these reaction buttons here. Yep. So yeah, let's take our next speakers. Anton would have the order on the slides. I think you're muted.
I'm muted. Yes, it's the eyes in case of emergency. So Chris, you can feel free to share your slides.
Yeah.
So, hello everyone. Thank you very much. On behalf of the International Art Collective Sympoietic Society to have us tonight. So hello to the Design Posthumanism Network, to the appreciated colleagues and everyone who took their appreciated time to come together here tonight. Eline, would you be so kind and go to the beginning of the presentation, please? Thank you very much. Listening to a glacier is a contradiction. We can feel the vibrations of its ice as it shatters and collapses, but we cannot hear its last will. Hearing and listening are here envisioned as two different things. To hear is to measure, while to listen is to invite embodied understanding and craft meaning. As we stand before you today, we invite you to engage with your senses, to immerse yourself in a day of remembrance and mourning, in a farewell to a glacier. My name is Christoph, and I'm happy to be here today with my appreciated colleagues Eline Gaude, currently in Espoo, Finland, and Isadora Alves in Lisbon, Portugal. And myself, I find myself currently in Sweden in Aarhus as part of the ASC Art Residency, currently based otherwise in Iceland. So we are all members of the Sympoietic Society, a pan-European art collective of emerging artists, curators, designers, performers, and researchers, dedicated to generating a critical dialogue and sustainable practices for multi-species futures. Together, we advocate for a social model organized around the principles of symbiosis, that it is of making with and therefore thinking with and becoming with human and the more than human entities. So for 2 years and then in full focus mode for 1 year, the Sympoietic Society researched and experienced and experimented with bodies of waters and local communities in Finland, Italy, and Austria as part of the interlocal project ICE in Case of Emergency, a series of art residences and transdisciplinary interventions addressing the ecological collapse of melting glaciers and bodies of water across Europe and the loss of related folklore in local communities. Composed of 3 research-based art residencies and connected public programs, the project collected stories and fostered moments of co-creation with human and more than human communities. Through close collaboration with partner institutions and local actors in CDB, Valcamonica and the UNESCO Biosphere Reserve Großes Walsertal, a wide range of artistic and cross-disciplinary interventions were developed. For example, ranging from participatory workshops, performances, lectures, storytelling events, and site-specific installations. The 3 residences culminated with a glacier ceremony, an art hike on the Rote Wand mountain and its glacier, which is also the habitat of the dying glacier. Next slide, please. So here, what we can see is basically a history which is stressing across the far reaches of the high glacial period to the present day. The Rote Wand Glacier has witnessed many transformations in the landscape over the millennia. Despite its historical significance, the glacier has been experienced rapid decline and is projected to vanish within the next 5 to 10 years. Transcending its impending extinction, this glacier acts as a unifying force. Its impending demise informed the genesis of our collective, prompting us to foster practices of care and create communal mourning moments for our more than human kin. So what we can see here is basically a drawing of the local glaciologist, Dr. Günther Gross, which is also part of the human community, which is based in the habitat of the glacier. And he was, throughout the research project, our art and science collaboration partner with his colleagues, and also provided the necessary data when it came down to satellite mapping, what we can see here on the very right-hand side, where we have a comparison of the glacier from 1950 in comparison to the state of the glacier in 2022, which was also the year when we initiated our project. Next slide, please.
All right, I will be taking over from here. Thank you, Christoph. So on September 9, 2023, ICE concluded with a public program and an art hike enacting a glacier ceremony to honor the existence of the Rote Wand Glacier. While part of the collective remained at our designated base camp to welcome visitors, others initiated their ascension to Rote Wand Ridge, accompanied by a team of local mountain guides and international volunteers. So I will be presenting to you the section concerning the public program and the base camp team, which I was personally a part of. So the base camp, which was envisioned as a communal space for collective mourning, the Alpe Placenza hut, is located at the foot of the Rote Wand mountain, and it hosted our public program throughout the day. Both members and visitors were invited to join and partake in the events in a day of grieving and remembrance for the glacier, a process that was facilitated by a series of components. So for instance, we curated a nomadic collective library, which we titled Learn to Mourn. And it reunited essays, books, and notes that we encountered throughout the research process of ICE. Thematic excerpts on bodies of water, art and activism, environmental storytelling were available for visitors to interact with, forming a shared community of knowledge. Furthermore, resulting from a cordialing expedition, the Never Forever glacier core sculpture acted as a living witness to the evolutionary changes of the Rote Wand Glacier. Fated to melt throughout the day, the core slowly revealed different layers of ice that had been contaminated throughout the years by different kinds of erosive material. Additionally, as the altitude team progressed to the summit, audiovisual insights were transmitted to the base camp, allowing both visitors and collective members to vicariously partake in the multi-sensory journey of the hikers. Alongside this communal mourning space, visitors were also invited to delve into guided embodied interventions. One of them, titled Singing into the Landscape, consisted of a participatory landscape performance. Participants were encouraged to harmonize and project their voices towards the mountain, forming a space that held both grief and solace through the act of singing together. Throughout the day, visitors were also encouraged to embroider the mourning veil, a tactile archive of grief, gathering stories of ecological loss, care, and remembrance. These stories, collected during all three ice residencies, were further relayed to the hikers, establishing a fragile yet tangible connection between the base camp and the altitude team. Finally, as the hikers reached the mountain ridge and initiated the glacier ceremony, members and visitors at the base camp were able to follow the alpine events through radio transmissions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Eline and Christoph. I will depart to talk with you about what happened in parallel to the base camp, which we called the altitude team. So the glacier ceremony had these two parallel interrelated events. So the altitude team departed early in the morning with this need to walk as if there was a need to digest, to witness in another way. While walking, a human might melt as glaciers do. If grief is facing an absence of something we used to know, as if swallowing an emptiness, sometimes facing grief means allowing one's emotions, and so allowing our vessels a passage through time, an erosion, a transformation. And so we walked and did not walk alone, as we believe no one does. We walked in constellations and in invisible correlations with our surroundings and with the base camp and the local communities. We were connected with the base camp, with members of the local communities that hiked with us, to mountain guides, and all there was around. We arrived at the summit at 11:58, a symbolic parallel with the doomsday clock, and the ceremony started after an initial classical minute of mourning, followed by a farewell speech written by the glaciologist Günter Gross, transmitted to the whole valley through radio and other invisible ways of waves of sound. So this testimony, told in the voice of the Rotewand, crystallized the coming together of decades of friendship between a human and a more than human entity, a loving researcher and his beloved one. Afterwards, we had the spreading of the ashes. They were collected from our fire talk events, were spread at the four winds, symbolizing memories, voices, hands, and warmth gathered together with our hosting communities over the past years. After the spreading of the ashes, a patchwork of textile created through submersion in the waters of our hosting communities was displayed on the glacier. The use of glacier sheets, traditionally employed to conserve ice cover from commercial purposes, was here subverted in an effort to elevate natural processes of decay and renewal embedded in time and space. The ceremony concluded with an artifact which was left upon the mountain ridge, a summit box containing a glacier register, inviting future hikers and witnesses to gather stories and record the remaining lifespan of the glacier, fostering a tangible connection between past, present, and future. The readings and performances enacted on the Rotewand summit acted as a farewell to the disappearing glacier, a coming together, and a moment of collective reflection in a time of profound ecological uncertainty. We went down, reaching the base camp by the end of the day to reunite, and all the while in the way up and in the way down, there was a whole lot of activities that correlated the two poles, either be it being able to see from far away, of through radio telling stories while walking, or through transmitting images and poems and recollections of the journey. The narratives of two poles splitting, some waiting and some traveling, of suing while waiting, these two sides of testimonying something are gestures that resemble several beginnings of storytelling, some deeply embedded in our Occidental Hellenic culture. The idea one's experience matters most if there is a place to return to, if there are some ones to tell it to, like we are doing right now. This classical narrative design was used as well as a means to be subverted. They are two ways of the many ways one can celebrate the Rotewand. The base camp and the altitude group were constantly intertwined in a choreography with the space which detach them and this space between them. Even though based on the notion that the ceremony is done for the living, through human recognition of other ways of life, as we know and as we don't know, subtle and major shifts in power structure can occur by fostering being in contact, by fostering learning together, creating visible and concrete relations with our abruptly changing surroundings. And with these, I guess we cover a bit of what was this event, what is possible to tell. And I guess Christoph will talk briefly about what we're about to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eline and Isadora. So our all-over approach was also how can this project be executed and then also being brought back in like different forms, like to the community. Therefore, we also made like sure that the entire project was documented, and therefore we would like to invite you tonight to a small screening for our community in here, where Anton is going to share like the link. And afterwards, after the documentary, we are very much looking forward to take everything further with the discussion. And thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Gletscher beerdigen bedeuten, es ist so warm geworden, dass wir auf der Erde ein Hochgebirgselement verlieren, das über Jahrtausende da gewesen ist.
Ein Gletscher ist etwas Erhabenes. Ja, sowas anzuschauen oder darüber zu gehen, das ist ein Urerlebnis.
The Sympoietic Society is a group of 9 artists from all over Europe.
In the last 12 months, we've been working on a project that is called ICE, in case of emergency, which is a deep research on ice and specifically on glaciers.
Und dies hat uns zu verschiedenen Kunstresidenzen in Sidibe in Finnland, in Italien, im Adamello Nationalpark und jetzt zum Abschluss des Projekts bis in den UNESCO-Biosphärenpark Großes Walzertal in Vorarlberg, Österreich geführt. Unterhalb des Gipfels der Roten Wand befindet sich einer der niedrigsten eingelagerten Gletscher unserer Nordalpen.
Now, the Rote Wand specifically, it's a dying glacier. Now, for a scientific point of view, it has reduced so much that it's not considerable a glacier anymore.
At the Clasença Alp, which will function as a place of mourning while the altitude group goes up. Altitude group to Clasença Hut. We will have a sculpture of ice. Okay, and the ice sculpture? That comes directly from the Rote Wand, and it will be melting all the way during these 7 hours of event.
10:30 when people come.
Perfect. Grazie, over.
Die Gletscherschmelze ist etwas, was Angst macht. Und zwar, sie schmelzen in einer Geschwindigkeit ab, die vorher nicht für möglich gehalten wurde. Auch nicht von mir als jemand, der sich seit über 50 Jahren mit Gletschern befasst.
We see the Rote Wand over.
Und was noch dazu kommt, ist die große Gefahr des schwindenden Permafrosts. Permafrost, der früher diese Felsen stabilisiert hat, der verschwindet zunehmend. Es wird vermehrt zu Felsstürzen kommen.
In einer Zeremonie wollen wir insbesondere die Existenz des noch verbliebenen Gletscherns würdigen und einfach auch anerkennen im Kollektiv, was bedeutet denn das auch für uns Menschen, wenn Gletscher irreversibel am Abschmelzen sind.
We come together to celebrate a farewell for the fellow Rotewand. We are here to bring testimony, to celebrate new and ancestral relationship with this land, and to pay respect to this dying glacier, the Rotewand. Inspired by the doomsday clock, we symbolically gather 90 seconds before 12 to reiterate our kinship with more than human ecosystems.
What we want to do is create a space for the communities that we engage with and to share feelings, stories, to remember how important certain stories and certain feelings are so that we can actually take care.
Is this combination, is this notion that when you do art, you open a space where the listener of a song, the spectator of a show, is being able to pass through an experience, and maybe after passing through this experience, only then he can have the sensitivity to think about other questions.
After distributing the ashes from various glacier habitats in Finland, Italy and Austria, we prepare for...
Wenn wir so lange warten, bis das Klima eine Eigendynamik entwickelt, dann ist es eben zu spät, wie bei den Gletschern. Wir müssen umdenken.
For me, it is too late. I have no more future at the Rotewand. My habitat has become too low, like everywhere else in the Eastern Alps. But perhaps, through rapid measures, the fatal momentum of the climate is about knowing that relations are an art. And relations within ourselves, within other human beings, within landscapes, ecosystems, more than humans, even glaciers.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation and also for the video. I think it's very poetic and very beautiful from a human perspective. And so I have a little provocative question. I wrote down, who cares about the glacier? And so isn't there a little paradox in the entire like process, which is very inherent to posthuman design in general, that it's, you know, isn't a melting glacier like a form of non-human agency, and it's the humans who don't like that the glacier is melting. And I think it goes a little bit in the direction of what Rosén is kind of criticizing in the shed. So I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on this friction And again, I think it's always inherent in posthumanism that we do it a little bit for us, you know.
It's hi, Sebastian. It's a great question, and I think we faced also this paradox all the while. I'll try to answer very fast, and I hope, if anything, Christoph and Eline can help me out. Yes, I completely agree with you. What also the way we departed was also to never erase the fact that that we cannot be human-centered to a certain perspective if we decide to take any step forward of which kind, any kind of way of translating reality or taking an action towards something. If we pretend it's not human-centered in a certain way, then I think that can also be paradoxical or not rooted. Here, for sure, our aim was not running away from being able to say, yes, this is also human-centered, but fostering relations with the local communities, with ourselves, and with whomever cares about the glacier, because it is at least proved that the glacier movement of melting has been faster and faster because of human action. So there, I don't know the relation between the glacier's own agency, if it is being pressured upon humans. And often the local communities also don't have so much relation with it. So a big focus of our project had to do with the idea of mourning the more than human within humans, and the understanding that we can only mourn the things we know. And we faced so a lot of more than human focused projects with very different age groups. For instance, the Glacier Ghost, which only dealt with children and local schools surrounding glacial habitats in Austria and in Italy and around the Alps, which fostered relations and singular relations of each human with more than human entities, amongst other kinds of actions. So yes, these try to not to be more than human and to think about the more than human without also erasing the notion that a tryout from a human will be human-centered. Moreover, if we think about a performance or a group gathering, it cannot be not human-centered to a certain point, or at least the way we try to underline human-centered is to try to not be hypocrite in our own ways, failing perhaps as well, trying.
Thank you. It will be fantastic to continue this discussion on the workshop. I'm sure many people have like, I also want to ask something. So please write down your questions and thoughts. You can also put them on the chat, but let's move to our next speaker.
I think
we have a theme. It's leaking, frictional water practices in the global south. Gabriela, so nice to have you here. Well, you're welcome to start your presentation.
Hi everyone. Here. Can you listen to me okay, properly?
Yes, we hear you well.
Yeah, thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Gabriela. I'm very grateful and honored to be here sharing my work with both the presenters and the audience. First of all, I'm a non-binary person who lives and works in the city of Santiago de Chile. I studied theory and art history at the most important university in my country, and my main job is teaching at the design school of a higher education institution here in Santiago. Currently, I'm a thesis student, and for some time now, I have been working with bodies of water, and these investigations have led me to generate links, networks, and to show my work mainly in Latin American countries. My artistic practice is linked to sound art and experimental electronic music. And last but not least, during pandemia, I was diagnosed with endometriosis, a chronic disease, which led me to become an activist in order to educate and raise awareness about it. I'm bringing you two problems that are my greatest obsessions these days. Both have relationship with dripping, and personally, I do not frame them within a critical exercise or the search for a concrete result, but rather they are ascribed to an exercise of experimentation that dialogues with a matter that decants into garbage. The two problems are water leaking in Santiago's subway stations and an iceberg exhibited in Sevilla, Spain, in the Chilean pavilion in 1992 in Expo Sevilla that celebrated the 500th anniversary of the discovery of America. The two problems are connected in the leakage experience, and leaking is the experience of dripping, where a speculative fable of progress is erected. The idea of progress, the rational ethics of life, and the commodification of existence. So I wrote three words: utility, comfort, and progress. The technique as material infrastructure and has as historical force capable of affecting the living, its relation with the ecological, the sustainability of development, and the inequalities that are a condition. And at the same time, a structural effect, the capitalist technical code. Thinkers to whom I summon to follow the traces of this ontological dignity of matter. I don't want to use the word use, but with the help of approaches coming from the new materialisms and critical posthumanism. That's how, for example, Jane Bennett promotes a political ecology that considers distributed agency in the material world. Donna Haraway explores how hybridity can confer new forms of resistance. Rossi Braidotti argues that the hegemonic position of the human as the center of all thought and knowledge is shifting toward a new, expanded, flexible, and multidimensional identity. And finally, Karen Barad claims there is nothing essentially separate from anything else. I would like to share some information about the city where I live so that you can get a general understanding of the context from which these reflections arise. Santiago de Chile is in South America. and the population is around 8 million inhabitants, and we have an elevation about 570 meters above sea level, and those are information about gross domestic product per capita. I wanted to do a comparison between a big country, USA and Sweden. Also, Santiago is located on the Pacific Ring of Fire, where two tectonic plates, the Nazca and South American plate, collide. Santiago is particularly a city of great social inequality. In addition to this, we have suffered several natural disasters that help to increase the social gap. Santiago is located in a valley in the central part of Chile, surrounded by the Andes and the Chilean coastal range. So we're in a valley, we're in a kind of a cup. I'm going to show you at the end of these presentations 2 videos that it's going to show you what I'm obsessed with, what I'm doing with my research. These are 2 videos about the leaking of water in a subway stations. And this is a picture about the problems that we have had in Chile, because the mega drought in Chile lasted from 2010 to 2019. It was due to the La Niña phenomenon, and this caused a decrease in rainfall in the southern hemisphere, where Chile is located. With this slide, we move from Santiago to Antarctica to show you the place from where a 60-ton iceberg was extracted from Bahía Paraíso to be exhibited in the summer of Seville as an important part of the Chilean Pavilion exhibition at Expo Sevilla 92. In case you are wondering, these pieces were transported in cold storage chambers. All of this happened 2 years after returning to democracy, after 17 years of dictatorship under Pinochet rule. I want to remain silent for a moment so that you can read these images. Chilean pavilion, at Expo Sevilla 92, in which the iceberg extracted from Antarctica was exhibited. Inside for 6 months, this monument was surrounded by a circle of lapislázuli. Lapislázuli is a semi-precious stone. Only you can find it in Chile and Afghanistan. And this addition about this stone around this monument was intended to make the iceberg appear bluish in color. In a kind of conclusion, linkage it is still not possible to displace anthropocentrism with its hierarchizations of reality, where the desires of a humanist equality have never been realized, even less the ontological dignity of other subjectivities. To end with, I would like to add that these matters that I have just shared could manifest themselves as places open to creative practices to preserve ecosystems, and as networks of material exchange for protection, support, and linkage to confront this Anthropocene. The field of contemporary art, which is already experimental and which asks questions, together with the field of design, and in its capacity to anticipate problems, can stimulate a debate and reflections on possible and impossible futures and the ethical implications of new subjectivities. In summary, this is the route we have followed during this talk to understand the potency, the power of non-human within humanist narrative. Thank you. Gracias. So those are videos that I take almost every day, especially during winter or during rainy season. We have the 4 seasons here really separated from each other. And it's an everyday scenario that you can see with the baskets, things to try to maintain the water inside. And it's super weird to pass by and see how people is trying to not to fall down and about this. So yeah, that is part, it's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you so much. Maybe some reactions. Woohoo. Okay, so now basically the presentations are over, and we are moving towards the workshop phase.